Thank you for coming. Hope you're enjoying your time here and learning a lot of good stuff. I'd like to introduce Dr. Raman Sankar. He is an epileptologist and also professor at Mattel Children's Hospital at UCLA. And so there you go. Here's your microphone.
Okay.
Please, let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a fairly informal and hopefully informative lecture to you. It's kind of a fairly vague title because it's kind of confusing what's new and, depends on where you have to make some sort of a cutoff point. So what I chose to do was I'll pick things that have been happening in the last 5 years and maybe looking ahead a little bit, what things may be out in the near future, right? And again, in the interest of time and in the interest of the fact that there are many other speakers at this meeting, I'm not going to necessarily dwell on things like, DNA-based therapies at this point. So this is truly going to be, as the title indicates, anti-seizure medications mainly, and rescue therapy. And because it's a lay audience, it's going to be very minimal in terms of slide content. It's going to be a conversation. So you're all welcome to interrupt me at any time. You don't have to wait till I'm go on forever, because it's really for you to ask. The nice thing about it is, if we do this correctly, I can tell you things that sometimes I don't get to tell other doctors when I give a drug company program, because this is not the content of what we talk about is not really restricted by the FDA. It's more open conversation, okay? So what I want to do is very radically just pick 5 years as the mark to say what's a relatively new drug and go over it. These are some of my disclosures, just so you know that I do have a close relationship with pharmaceutical companies. I'm an advisor for many of them, and I also speak for many of them, although this is not supported by anybody. I have other potential interests, such as book royalties. Those are some of the books. Some of you may find that book to be of interest, although it's not written for lay people. It's really written for epileptologists, just so you know. Okay. And so I was going to start by talking about perampanel, simply because it is 2017 is when it got approved. Goes under the name of Fycompa. If we had gone 1 year back, it would have pulled in Briviact. But if some of you have questions about Briviact, I will still entertain it, right? Because this 5 year is not a rigid rule. So if you want to, pick my brain about what you want to know about Briviact, that's cool, okay? So Fycompa, came as a very novel drug because it works against a particular type of receptor that we call AMPA receptor. That's a important target in epilepsy, and at the moment we don't have other medications that target it. And it was shown to be very effective for focal epilepsy as well as what we call primary generalized tonic-clonic epilepsy. What many people think, lay people sometimes use the term grand mal, but grand mal is not always primary, right? Sometimes it's generalization from a focal seizure. Other times it just starts that way. So perampanel works for it. Its limitation is some people get irritability, so it's not for everybody. But if you tolerate it, it is, quite effective, one of the more effective medications, and it's convenient features are it needs to be taken only once a day. Usually you take it in the evening. It has a very long half-life. So the half-life is so long, the curve looks so flat that if you look at during the course of the day, there is very little fluctuation in the blood level. You know how with some medications we say we want a trough level, don't get it right after you take it, etc., etc. One of the advantage to me as a clinician of this even level, right, is that you're taking it once a day. If you accidentally missed a dose, nothing terribly bad happens because, the drug doesn't decline so fast. That curve is so gentle in its slope. The other useful thing to a clinician is, of course, if you complain about a particular side effect, I don't have to agonize whether it is because the blood level is high. In other words, if I see you in the clinic and your exam doesn't show that, let's say, lack of coordination, I assume that you don't have it at any time, right? Because the blood level is about the same. So that's kind of a nifty thing. The pills are really small, except for the 2 milligram pill, they're all about the same size. The liquid allows you to titrate even slower. An interesting sidelight of this very long half-life is I tell people, because we know sometimes it can give you irritability, mood changes, to titrate really, really slow. The recommendation is to, start with 2 milligrams if you're a full-size person, adolescent or adult, and then you go weekly. Now, I, on the other hand, tell people, no, you don't need to go weekly because it's actually not at steady state in 1 week. Steady state, where the blood level evens out for that dose, takes nearly 3 weeks. So, if the patient went from 2 to 4, do they need to go from 4 to 6? It's not obvious to me just in 1 week. I would like to wait and see so they can adapt to it more and are perhaps less likely to have the side effect. Other than that, it seems to be very safe. There is no requirements for checking liver function, blood counts, or any of that, right? So those are some of the advantages. It is approved in young people. It comes as a liquid, and the liquid is, basically 1 milligram in 2 ml, so you can titrate as slow as you want, okay? In 2018, the first cannabinoid product, cannabidiol, got approved under the brand name of Epidiolex. At that time, the company was called GW Pharma, which eventually became Greenwich, and then it got acquired by Jazz Pharma, the new owners. And its labeling has been kind of interesting. It was initially approved for Dravet. That was in 2018. Then a couple of years downstream, it got approved for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And then more recently, it got approved for tuberous sclerosis. So it's still under that rare diseases mark, but with multiple, types of seizures. One of the meanings of approval for Lennox-Gastaut, it automatically suggests that it probably works for different types of seizures, because Lennox-Gastaut patients have multiple types of seizures, okay? And likewise for tuberous sclerosis. It comes as an oral solution. The important thing to remember about Epidiolex is it's basically a substance that is made dissolved in sesame oil. So Asian folks, particularly Chinese, Koreans, or folks like me, I come from India, we are extremely well adapted and fondly use sesame oil for cooking. But a lot of I will use that term carefully, white people, for instance, they don't seem to tolerate sesame oil consistently. So sometimes the biggest side effect, unlike with most seizure drugs we talk about, you may get incoordinated, you may get sleepy, right? Fatigue. With cannabidiol, the more common side effects are actually coming from the vehicle. It's coming from the sesame oil, not the ingredient, okay? Remember that. And that has some interesting consequences. It needs to be taken with food, preferably fatty food. So there are two reasons. One reason is, if you don't, with many drugs, if you take it on an empty stomach, you get peak levels quickly, right? But not with cannabidiol. It is so fatty that it can't even disperse itself to be absorbed, right? So it's actually absorbed better when taken with a fatty meal. Many years ago, there was a company that was trying to bring a synthetic form of CBD, and we were trying to do a trial for infantile spasms, and the babies were getting it first thing in the morning. It's only well at the conclusion of the trial that we made the sorry realization that that is the worst way to give this medication, that the absorption is extremely poor. So we thought it didn't work very well in that population. Actually, what was happening was they were not getting much of the medication absorbed, right? So it's much better absorbed when taken with a fatty meal, right? The other important thing is, if you are genetically predisposed to not tolerate it and get upset stomach, that's also less likely if you have a lot of food, because it dilutes the sesame oil, right? So you definitely do not want to take it on an empty stomach, right? That's a key thing to know. The other thing to remember is it has significant synergy with clobazam, okay? So the interaction with clobazam is very, very significant, but it's not really a liability. It can be an asset. So it just means you need to be on a lower dose of clobazam. If somebody is on clobazam, and if anybody is still using only the brand name, it's Onfi, right? But any form of clobazam, when you go on Epidiolex, we like to make sure that how the blood levels of clobazam, and it has an active metabolite, we have to track those. The other thing we track with the Epidiolex is liver functions. It turns out the likelihood of liver functions going up seems to be mostly if it is added to somebody who's on valproic acid, that some of you may know as Depakote or Depakon, right? In the absence, it doesn't seem to be a big issue. However, the recommendation is that you get baseline liver function levels and then track them after 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. Okay? And usually in those in whom liver functions went up, excuse me, in those in whom the liver functions went up, it usually typically stabilized. Nobody really got into trouble, like liver failure and anything like that, but there was an elevation transiently in the enzyme, so that should be followed. Other than that, like I said, the interaction with clobazam is often taught to be pharmacokinetic, meaning check blood level of clobazam, but it's more than that. The cannabidiol actually has some direct action on the same target that we call GABA receptors, okay? And we don't know at the moment whether there is more to this product than those aspects, right? Because for those of you who are learning a lot about contemporary nutritional things, and thank you, nutritional things or things about, you're learning about the microbiome and polyphenols, right? Remember, cannabidiol is technically a polyphenol. right? There is some evidence that in some kind of inflammatory bowel disease, it actually calmed inflammation when used, okay? So there are some other dimensions to it, but we don't know at the moment how relevant all of those are in epilepsy, okay? So that's Epidiolex. Yeah, please.
Are they looking at putting out a different version that's not in sesame oil?
To my knowledge, not at the moment. It's conceivable, but it seems like the problem is not big enough that they don't think it has a market impact, and I think it's manageable. But at one time, I had access to a product, the synthetic CBD, that actually was not in sesame oil, but was in MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil. So presumably the compound can be dispersed, but this is what this company chose, and they're sticking to it, to my knowledge. Yeah.
What's the mode of action for this? The mode of action.
Of
Action.
of cannabidiol.
Yeah, this one in particular, I guess.
Yeah, the mode of action for cannabinoids in general is complicated, difficult to easily say it in lay terms, because it's part of a signaling system that we call neuromodulators. So it indirectly changes neurotransmitter release for excitatory neurotransmitters, enhances inhibitory neurotransmission. It's actually made in the postsynaptic terminal and then migrates out and has some effect on the presynaptic terminal. It's really a more complex pharmacology than as simple as many of the other drugs.
That's why I asked.
Yeah.
It's not a one-on-one.
Yeah, we know many aspects of it. We don't know all about it, right? It seems to have significant action in a type of receptor that has been studied a lot. And last year, people got two different doctors got Nobel Prize called the transient receptor potential vanilloid. That a lot of people in epilepsy don't know much about it, but pain people study it. But there's some old data that may influence epilepsy also, and that those receptors have been found in high concentration in resected temporal lobe tissue from people with temporal lobe epilepsy. So that may be yet another mechanism, right? And it probably has other things we don't know yet. Okay? Yeah.
Would you say this is also a good prescription for someone who has CE?
Who has?
Someone who has CE for catamenial epilepsy?
The question, I'll restate so everybody can hear. The question is this a particularly good drug for catamenial epilepsy? I don't have any data to suggest that it's uniquely useful for catamenial epilepsy.
It was just recently suggested for my daughter because she really struggles with catamenial epilepsy in addition to local seizures.
Yeah.
You know, everything.
There are many approaches to catamenial epilepsy, None of the new medications in particular are thought to be so, although there is one that I'm going to talk about downstream that just got approved this year that has a very narrow indication but may have some relationship. So don't let me forget, I'm going to talk a little bit more about catamenial epilepsy towards the end. Okay? Yeah. All right. So then another drug that got approved in 2018 is called stiripentol or Dicomit by Biocodex. This is a medication that has been around for a very long time. It actually was tried for focal epilepsies way back in the 1980s when I first heard about it, before I had even finished my neurology residency. And then it kind of died on the vine at that time, because one of the things it does is it very strongly inhibits metabolism of other medications. If you go way back in the 1980s, we had very few anti-seizure drugs. So one of the few things almost everybody was on was carbamazepine.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody was on carbamazepine, And what stiripentol did when you added it is carbamazepine levels shot up. So the FDA looked at the data and they said, we can't figure out whether your medicine is working or it is just pumping up the carbamazepine levels that's working. And then they didn't work that out fully, right? They kind of went out of the scene and then they reappeared in France for Dravet syndrome. We are not entirely sure why it is particularly effective in some cases of Dravet syndrome, because it seems the understood mechanism is a lot like phenobarbital, which we don't talk about anymore, right? It's kind of barbiturates-like in one form, but barbiturates tend to induce metabolism of other drugs. This does the other way. It inhibits, right? So one of the funny things about it is its indication in Europe can be used for Dravet syndrome. Guess what the American label says? It says it may be used for Dravet syndrome adjunctive to clobazam, because the clobazam levels shoot up way more than Epidiolex does. To the point, the FDA feels, just like they did in the 80s with carbamazepine, they think it's really, you should use it with clobazam, not by itself. But that is different from the European Medicine Agency, where it is approved as plain vanilla. Okay? So it's a small, narrow indication in America. It's not found a big niche. It's possible that in this entire room nobody's on stiripentol. Right? That's often the case. So the company is struggling with it a little bit, and we had a little advisory board talking about why that may be. Okay? So, cenobamate. If you are a reasonably grown person and not a baby, and with focal epilepsy, with or without generalized seizures accompanying it, then I would say in the recent couple of years, no medication has gotten so much attention as this, right? So I have to go out on a limb and tell you that it has a higher fraction of patients who achieve not just the 50% seizure reduction that the FDA looks at, but a higher fraction are achieving 75% to even 100%. So in my own practice, which is completely off-label, because I have a bunch of kids who are not 18 years old, right? It's approved for adults, but I'm not prevented. I just can't. People can't promote it that way, but I can talk to you about anything I want in this forum. So a lot of my kids are usually in the 10, 12, 14-year range. And several of them who are lined up for surgery, right? They were on the track for surgery, but now they're on a side track. Because the parents are wondering, why do I want to do that? He's not having any seizures, right? So it's very, very effective. And to those who want to listen to me very technically, the neuroscience type of people, it has become kind of a passion of mine to explain to them my understanding of why it seems to be so different from other medications. So if you look at the company's own literature, when it comes to mechanism, I have to say it's pretty lame. Because it tells you it's a sodium channel blocker, right? It makes it sound as though it's just like lamotrigine or lacosamide or all those guys. But it isn't. What is really interesting about it, I'm going to make it very simple so it won't be scientifically precise. There are different kinds of sodium channels, okay? When it comes to epileptic neurons, there is a sodium channel that we call NAV 1.6, right? It's coded by a gene some of you may have heard of called SENA8. That's very different than the Dravet one, which is SENA1. SCNA8 codes for a gene that creates that sodium channel. That current is like a big, slow hump. So what happens is it raises the membrane potential to where from which it's easy to fire action potentials that rely on the more traditional SAN1A gene product, right? NAV 1.1. Now, the typical medication's limitation is both NAV 1.1 and NAV 1.6 are useful in limiting the excitability of the epileptic neuron. But the downside of hitting both of them is the 1.1 is also there in a different set of neurons that actually squirt GABA to put out the fire. See, we don't want to block them. So the interneurons that squirt GABA to put out the fire, right, they have only 1.1. They don't have 1.6. So at the moment, this is the only medication that actually does not. It's a sodium channel blocker, but not the 1.1. Right? So this discovery was made by the company's basic scientists, but the marketing people are not reading the basic scientists in their own company. Right? So I am very excited about it because I think it's a very important lesson for future drug development. I'm always looking ahead to, what can we have tomorrow that one-ups all the medications we have. And I think the direction for sodium channel drugs is to hit only the epileptic neuron and not the GABA squirting interneuron, not the good guy who's putting out the fire, right? So I think it's very, very exciting. Likewise, it has some GABA action, but its GABA action is not at all like a barbiturate or a benzodiazepine. So its GABA action is not like Onfi. It's not like Valium. It's not like midazolam. It's very, very different. The only medication we have now that has the same type of GABA action as this, with a very narrow indication, is coming. Right? These are called tonic chloride currents that are very different than what synaptic chloride currents are. These are outside the synapse. Okay? So it's a very novel type of drug. It's unlike any other medication mechanistically. And I think it is teaching us a little bit about what may be very important to get to the next phase of better epilepsy medication. Having said that, the only cross it has to bear is for safety requirements, and it's not entirely new because you dealt with this with lamotrigine years ago. It has got to be titrated very, very slow. Most patients are in the dose range of 200 to 400 milligrams, right? With the sweet spot maybe 300 for a typical adult. A lot of my kids in the 10 to 12 years are on 200, 250 already, right? And yet, we are going to start at 12.5 milligrams for 2 weeks, 25 for 2 weeks, 50 for 2 weeks. At the end of 2 months, you are only at 100 milligrams. Fortunately, it begins to show good effect already in many patients. But nevertheless, there is no instant karma here, right? You got to be a little patient, but once you get there, it seems to be really well tolerated in my practice. Now, if you or your family member or yourself are on climbing that slope of dosing up, if you do get dizzy, I'll tell you the secret to avoid that dizziness. You need to lower, if you are on lacosamide or lamotrigine, you need to slow those down. Because they're sodium channel blockers, there's an overlap, right? They didn't work well enough for you, that's why you came here. Now what you need to do to maximize this is if you get too sedated, lower that clobazam if you're on it. If you're getting dizzy, uncoordinated, lower that lamotrigine or lacosamide or whatever, right? Sodium channel drug, then you'll do very well with this. Okay? There is no laboratory monitoring of blood count or liver function. So once you get up to the dose, you're in a pretty safe space.
And doctor, would you mind just sharing a little bit about, we're looking out for this, like signs of DRESS syndrome. What are some of the signs as you're titrating up? What might indicate that you...
The DRESS syndrome really is a multi-system disorder.
Yeah.
It involves skin, liver, various things, and the blood count will show enhanced eosinophils. But basically, the patient is going to just really look very, very sick, evolving sickness. You won't know the eosinophilia. It's a blood test that will tell you.
Yeah.
But it is multi-system.
Got
It is quite rare. And this is not the only medication associated with it.
Sure.
Right? It's been known for a long, long time. People have known DRESS from sulfa drugs, the old antibacterials, right? You can get potentially DRESS from lamotrigine, just not commonly. Okay? Yeah?
Do you have anybody that's using Xcopri and Epidiolex?
At the moment, no.
Are there any interactions that you know of? Or?
There could be, but they're not been well studied. Yeah. Xcopri does increase the level of lacosamide, that there is an interaction there. It does enhance the effectiveness of clobazam. That's why if you encounter side effects I mentioned, you should definitely consider lowering those. Okay? All right. Then there is fenfluramine, which is at the moment probably one with unsurpassed efficacy in Dravet syndrome. Okay? So fenfluramine comes as a liquid. There are some important things to know about it. It was initially approved in 20, and now it's approved for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So it's kind of there in that league, kind of like Epidiolex, right? And so it's a oral suspension. It only comes in that form. The most important thing are it again needs to be monitored carefully, because this is a kind of a complicated history. Many, many years ago, there was a diet product called fen-phen. One of the phens in the fen-phen was fenfluramine, right? So people who are on fen-phen were on a high dose of these medications, and a bunch of them got into heart trouble. But you have to understand, they were also high-risk people, because in order to go to fen-phen, you got obese first. And obesity has its own baggage. Okay? Nevertheless, mechanistically, there's a potential for impact on heart valves. So the FDA requires, kind of like those of you who were in vigabatrin or Sabril, knew that there was a REMS with eye exams. REMS stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy by the FDA. For this, you need to get a cardiac echo to get a baseline, and you will get a cardiac echo every 6 months. And then if you stop taking it, you will have to get one more echo, 1 to 3 months after. That's a requirement. The good news is, so far, used in these conditions for epilepsy in the correct dose, nobody seems to have developed any heart valve problems. So there's a large database so far of thousands of patients on it. Nobody is developing that toxicity. So it's just a precautionary thing. But it does add a factor, right? When I want to write, I have to first make sure they get that echo done, and then that has to be filed into Fintepla Central, a website, before the drug will be released. So it comes from a central pharmacy, right? So we have to go through a little process with it. And then now it has the approval for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So I mentioned to you the cardiac monitoring. Couple of more things. The dose is very, very strictly managed, partly because of that concern, right? So if you are on diacomint, which we talked about, stiripentol, there's a completely different dosing regimen. You hit the ceiling earlier. Okay? So the dosing is in two parts. Those who are on stiripentol, those who are not. At the moment, of course, very few people are on stiripentol, so that's not a big issue. The other important thing, again, I cannot say this if it was a promotional talk, but because it's not a promotional talk, I can say this. What would you want to know for your family member? What may be something fenfluramine brings? Right? One thing it brings for Dravet is it's supremely effective. For Lennox-Gastaut, it's effective, but I can't tell you it is supremely effective. It's as effective as many other things with the Lennox-Gastaut label. But the tricky little thing is by mechanism of action, fenfluramine or Fintepla differs from everything else we have, right? Because it works on serotonergic receptors, which are a lot of them in the brain stem. And it seems they may have something to do, we know they have something to do with regulation of respiration and heart rate. Now we also know in a number of animal models that when they misfunction, they get spontaneous respiratory or cardiorespiratory arrest. In humans, that's what we call SUDEP in epilepsy, right? So we have some mouse models that also have SUDEP. There are epileptic mouse models. And what we have learned is, in one of them at least, it seems when they put this on fenfluramine that spontaneous cardiorespiratory arrests go way down. They become very well protected, and it happens at a dose that is below the dose that the mice need to control their seizures. So what I'm saying is the benefit to saving their life seems independent of seizure reduction. So the rhetorical question is, on your Lennox-Gastaut patient, yeah, it looks as good as several other drugs, but is it bringing something else in the bargain? Maybe, right? In the future, we don't have a good handle on SUDEP at this point, right? You always go to these meetings and hear about SUDEP, but nobody gives you a solution, other than they say, if you're a candidate for surgery, get it. There is some neurostimulations may lower it, right? But the best thing is good seizure control. But here, it may be even before you have good seizure control. So that kind of makes that target interesting. Just like I told you earlier, Excopri's target of selective sodium channel of a particular type creates interest. So these are little glimmers of hopes to me that are new in this decade. We could not deal with these at an earlier time. Okay? All right. Ganaxolone, one of the most recently approved medication, it works on a type of GABA receptors that are the same ones Excopri or cenobamate works on. These are not in the synapse, okay? These are elsewhere on the outside the synapse, but they kind of control inhibition in a different way, okay? And I mentioned earlier, I will come back to catamenial seizures. Okay, so let's take an offshoot to talk about catamenial seizures. The seizures that are catamenial have three different patterns, two of them more common. One type occurs mid-cycle, around the time of ovulation. Another type occurs early in the period. Okay? And the third one is a little crazy and can be any time. And then it begs whether it's really catamenial. But let's talk about the other two that have a very understandable pattern. That has to do with female hormones. So you got estrogen, you got progesterone, right? So estrogens are actually bad boys when it comes to seizures. Okay? Progesterone, on the other hand, is very protective. P for protective, right? And progesterone is protective also. It supports the fetus, right? It's protective of the fetus. It makes the uterine line thick. It brings nourishment to the fetus. It supports pregnancy, basically. It also protects you from seizures. It works on a type of GABA receptor, right? That's where ganaxolone and cenobamate work. So now let's go back and see what are these patterns. So one pattern is in the first half of pregnancy, right? The Graafian follicles, the follicles in the ovary are maturing, and as they grow, they make more and more estrogen. So at mid-cycle, your estrogen peaks, and that's why some people have seizures in mid-cycle. However, what happens when it peaks, it actually shoots out the ovum, right? So the egg is then thrown out, ready to be fertilized, and the remainder of the follicle, right, that contained the ovum initially, that follicle becomes what in Latin is called the corpus luteum, which just means yellow body. And it actually starts secreting progesterone. So what it is doing is, evolutionarily, it's shooting out an ovum and says, go find your buddy, a sperm, I'll get other things ready for you. Right? It starts making progesterone, and then progesterone thickens the uterine wall, gets it ready for implantation, etc. So in those period, from mid-cycle on, your progesterone level is going up, up, up. But remember, progesterone is your buddy if you have seizures. So that's well and good. But at 2 weeks end or so, the system realizes that that egg hasn't been fertilized. There is really nothing to implant. So the body says, hell with it, and the whole lining, everything sloughs off. So you lose the corpus luteum. So what happens? Progesterone comes crashing down. So one way to think of it is it's a progesterone withdrawal seizure. You see where I'm getting at? So that's why some people have considered in the basic science side, in rats and things, how about we use ganaxolone? Because the way progesterone improves seizures is it works on that extrasynaptic GABA receptors. And that's where ganaxolone works. But ganaxolone is released under rare medicines, right? Orphan indication for CDKL5. So your adolescent having,
She's 24.
yeah, it doesn't matter, is not going to get ganaxolone prescribed, right? It may be effective, but can't do it. Nobody's going to cover it. It'll cost you incredible amounts of money. On the other hand, this is again, there is data yet to come. This is purely speculative. Your neurologist may not have said it, but I pay more attention to MOA than almost any epileptologist I know, because that's my culture. I started that way, right? I would venture to say if somebody has focal epilepsy and catamenial epilepsy is a big problem for them, they should consider Xcopri, because it works on that same GABA receptor where progesterone works, not the GABA receptor where Onfi works. Okay? So that's kind of an interesting thing. Yeah?
Sorry, I'm short. I understand. My daughter is on Xcopri, but she's also triple X. So
Can you speak a little louder? Also, I can't see you because of that light.
my daughter uses Xcopri, but she's also triple X. Does that affect with her 3X chromosomes?
Oh, you know what? That's an interesting question for which I don't have a ready-made answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's interesting that you brought that up, because she does have seizures around her period.
Yeah, seizures around the period, regardless, have to do with usually crashing of progesterone. So the people at NIH who developed some of the pharmacology behind ganaxolone put considerable effort into proposing it. But one of the funny things is, you see, sometimes you come up with a great idea in the science lab. Pharma money people may not pick it up. They will say it's a pain in the butt to do a trial on just, epilepsy associated with menstrual periods. How are you going to get enough population? The FDA doesn't have a good benchmark on how to quantitate that. Then the companies would say, we'll never get this through. We're going to spend millions, go nowhere. So it doesn't mean it may not work. It just, unfortunately, is not indicated for it, right? And therefore, you won't be able to get it because it's under pretty expensive drug, because CDKL5 is a very small population. The only way you can make a business of it is, I don't know the price, but it's probably more than $50,000 a year. Yeah. Okay. However, the good news is cenobamate does have action on that type of benzodiazepine, the extrasynaptic receptors. Okay. So that's the interesting thing with ganaxolone. I don't want to go into CDKL5. We have a CDKL5 clinic in our program, so we have a few customers for it. My colleague, Dr. Raj, is big on that. Then one medication that may come relatively soon, I don't want to go into things that are not already there, but a compound that was until recently called Takeda 935 was being developed by a company called Ovid. Last year, Takeda kicked Ovid out, so Ovid's name is no longer in there. It's been named soticlestat. It's under development for Dravet and LGS, even some other things like Dup15q syndrome and those rare things. It is also works by a very different mechanism than anything we have. It is what they call a cholesterol 24-hydroxylase inhibitor. Now, why does it control seizure? Again, like I say, it's a very novel thing. It seems to, again, I should disclose a conflict. I am on the data safety monitoring board of this particular company.
We have a question back here
Huh?
from the last.
Yeah, I was wondering, what are the pros and cons of Nasolam?
We're coming to that. We're going to, we haven't gone there yet.
Oh.
We're coming to rescue
Oh, okay.
very soon. Yeah. Okay. So soticlestat seems to be very well tolerated so far. It's probably going to come again for Dravet and LGS for sure, probably some other things. Okay. That's so far looks there are no major issues. Now we come to Nasolam, your question. Okay. So the concept of having a rescue drug medication for seizures is one of the most obvious common sense things. And yet, outside of pediatrics, they've had very poor uptake. Historically, that's because the first medication that came for rescue use was diazepam rectal gel under the brand name Diastat. Okay? It had a very, very poor uptake for two reasons, right? Number one, you may have noticed, because you all know at least one neurologist, right? Neurologists as a tribe are not the most socially well-adjusted people, They have issues, And they're squeamish. They don't like to talk about rectum and anus, right? So this is a problem when a drug is available only in that form. So they don't open that topic altogether. And then, we had this big issue when it first came. I went to Sacramento multiple times to testify in front of the House in California because the School Nurses Association said they're not going to let Diastat be used in schools, right? But there was a little bit of their own access to grind because all the schools don't have an RN. So they thought they would use it as a leverage to get more RN positions. But the FDA had approved it for use by lay people, right? But with the awkwardness that beyond a certain age, it becomes socially difficult. There are a lot of circumstances where you can, it's not even logistically that easy, even in the privacy of your own home, to undress a seizing person, right? So it had very good uptake in pediatrics, in toddlers and little kids. But as people became older, we continued to overuse the emergency department. Then, of course, now we have COVID and all these things. Right now there is so much respiratory virus syndromes, right? RSV and everything. Every emergency department is so overcrowded. That's not where you want to be to get prompt attention. Secondly, if you are a family member of somebody with epilepsy, you already know more about epilepsy than average emergency room people, right? So your best bet is actually to treat unexpected seizures, seizure clusters at home on your own. And now we have 2 products that are nasal sprays. Both are highly effective. Both are incredibly easy to use. You see a picture on the right. There are migraine medications that come in the same type of dispenser. The most important thing to tell you is, the Nasalam comes from the company called UCB that brought you things like Keppra and Briviact and Vimpat and all those things. They acquired it from Upshur Smith. And, again, it stops seizure clusters. A word about seizure clusters, both Nasalam and the other one we talked about yesterday, Valtoco, they always mention clusters. You don't have to obsess over it, right? If your family member is seizing, you can use it. You don't say, oh, I need to have at least 3 to call it a cluster. The reason they use the cluster and they go over and over on cluster, when I give company talks, because they have to stick to the FDA mandate, the FDA, that's how they prove that something worked. You see, what happens is, vast majority of seizures stop in a couple of minutes. So you can't tell the difference sometimes, whether the medication is working in 10 minutes. So they instead benchmarked, let's observe for 6 hours and 24 hours and see whether seizures reoccurred. That's why they use the term cluster, because that's how it was shown to the FDA. And the FDA sometimes, I'm going to be politically vulnerable to say this, but sometimes they say stupid things, right? One of the other things they tell you, a whole bunch of drugs, they tell you, you have to swallow them in whole, you cannot chew them. That's the most insane thing I ever heard. Because if you have an extended release preparation, that's true, because of the technology of the pill. But things like, Aptium or Xcopri, there's nothing wrong chewing it. The tablet is supposed to fall apart in your tummy, right? There is actually a test called disintegration test. So we fully expect it to completely fall apart to release the drug. But if you ask the FDA, why did you put that language? They'll say, oh, the studies were done that way, right? So they put everything in the package insert according to the study, and they tell the company, that's all you can talk about. But in real life, all tablets fall apart, right? Likewise, you don't wait for a seizure. It's been 15 minutes and you're saying, oh, it's still seizure number 1, it's not a cluster, right? No, that's a seizure emergency, right? So you do use it. The good news is, this study showed, the Nasalam study, Nasalam had to do an efficacy study because midazolam has not been used for seizure rescue before. Valtoco, which I talked about in detail yesterday, they didn't have to do an efficacy study. They just had to show blood levels were achieved because Diastat had already done the efficacy study, right? And up to 24-hour data is present. The key thing to know is Nasalam is labeled for 12 years and older, okay? So that's where the difference is. Valtoco is labeled for 6 years and older. And Valtoco, if you've been using Diastat previously, it's the same ingredient. You are already very familiar with how your child reacts. The only thing is it's a lot easier to use. Okay? The FDA thought, even though they were going to write on the label for Diastat, the FDA, honestly, one time they did something very smart. They labeled it a superior product. It had much tighter, maximum concentration achieved, time to maximum concentration. It was, just a better product. And the key thing I want everybody to know is I don't use it only for patients who have bad epilepsy. In pediatrics, I sometimes come across things like Rolandic seizures or sleep deprivation related seizures where recurrence risk is unclear. And a possibility exists that the recurrence risk is really, really small. And then the family doesn't want to take a daily medication that may give them side effects. So if we go with no medication, but knowing that the individual had a seizure once, it's a lot of peace of mind to say they have a rescue on hand. So that's one of the scenarios. Time is almost up. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up. That's fortunately my last slide. We have one question.
Yeah. Are those only administered to someone as having grand mal?
I can't hear you.
Are those only administered to someone as having grand mal, or are they given that?
No, it doesn't have to be a grand mal. It does not have to be a grand mal. It can be a focal seizure that has gone.
Have like an intense aura or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, having said that, then, if you're the person myself who has that close to yourself, if you're at the stage where you're still able to get the thing,
They're not designed or indicated for self-administration. Okay? Because judgment may be impaired. The other thing I want to tell as I wrap up, with both these, you remember the dispensers look exactly the same for Valtoco and Nasolam, and one of the companies has that stupid statement that says, no assembly or priming necessary. That's wrong language. You should never prime. Okay? You know why? There's only one dose there. It's not like your nasal decongestant that you want to make sure it works. Do not ever prime, because you're in an emergency when you use it and you just lost it. Okay? There's only one dose. It's foolproof delivery. It'll work. Okay? All right. Thank you all for coming. I hope you found it useful.